Hello everyone, we are going to study law of demand and we will study assumptions and exceptions to the law of demand. So today's topic is law of demand and assumptions and exceptions to the law of demand. Okay, so first of all I want to explain the concept of law of demand. So law of demand is an important law in economics which explains the relationship between change in quantity demanded and change in price. So important point is law of demand is an important law in economics which explains the relationship between change in quantity demanded and change in price. But question is which type of relationship between price and quantity demanded. So if higher the price, the lower would be the quantity demanded in the market, and the lower the price, the higher would be quantity demanded in the market. That's mean the law of demand says that the price and quantity demanded are negatively related and all other things being equal. All other things means like a taste of the buyer and lot of substitutes and income level, etc. So all other things being constant. Law of demand explain inverse relationship between price and demand of a commodity. Other things being equal, demand increase on a fall in price and decrease on a rise in price. Law of demand is a relationship between price and quantity demanded. I have taken two type of variable. I mean to say law of demand operates with two types of variable. First is price and second one is demand. But this type of relationship is always inverse. Law of demand operates but only price and quantity demanded. This relationship is inverse. Change in quantity demanded and change in price. Which type of relationship? If higher the price, the lower would be quantity demanded in the market, and the lower the price, the higher would be quantity demanded in the market. But all other things being constant, being same. Which type of other things? Like taste of the buyer, substitutes goods and income level of a person remain constant. Okay, some more important point, law of demand. Law of demand, I mean to say relationship between price and demand is inverse but not necessarily proportionate. Focus on this point. I mean to say relationship between price and demand is always inverse, you know, but not necessarily proportionate. It is important to note that law of demand is only a qualitative statement and not a quantitative statement. Law of demand is only a qualitative statement and not a quantitative statement. This law explains that demand of a commodity increases on a fall in price and decreases on an increase in price, but it does not tell how much demand will increase on a certain fall in price. Okay, law of demand indicates only the direction of change. Law of demand indicates only the direction of change in demand, but it does not establish any arithmetic relationship between price and demand. Okay, law of demand is only qualitative statement and not a quantitative statement. Qualitative statement, not a quantitative statement. That means this law explains that demand of a commodity increases on a fall in price and decreases on an increase in price. But it does not tell how much demand will increase on a certain fall in price. It tells if price increases, demand decreases. If price decreases, demand increases. But it does not tell how much demand will increase on a certain fall in price. That means law of demand is only a qualitative statement and not a quantitative statement. Qualitative statement and not a quantitative statement. Okay. Now I am going to explain assumptions of the law of demand. I mean to say law of demand operate with these assumptions. Law of demand explains the relationship between price and quantity demanded. I have told you, and this relationship is always inverse. If price increases, demand decreases. If price decreases, demand increases. But law of demand operates with these assumptions. Okay, so I am going to explain these assumptions. First assumption is income level should remain constant. First assumption is income level should remain constant. The law of demand operates only when the income level of the buyer remains constant. If the income rises when the price of the commodity in question does not fall, it is quite likely that the demand may increase. Therefore, stability in income is an essential condition. Okay, stability in income is an essential condition for the operation of the law of demand. Otherwise, it does not operate. So, income level should remain constant. Okay. So, second assumptions which I am going to discuss, taste of the buyer should not change. That means any change that takes place in the taste of the consumer will in all probability prevent the working of the law of demand. If often happen that when taste or fashion change, people revise their preferences. Okay, if often happen that when taste or fashion change, any type of fashion change, people revise their preferences. So taste of the buyer should not change. Third assumption is price of other goods should remain constant. Price of other goods should remain constant. Changes in the prices of other goods often affect the demand for a particular commodity. If prices of a commodity for which demand is inelastic rise, the demand for a commodity other than these in all probability will decline even though there may not be any change in its price. Therefore, for the law of demand to operate, it is very necessary that prices of other goods don't change. Next assumptions is a no new substitute for the commodity should be developed. These are two different points. Third assumption, explain the concept price of other goods should remain constant. But fourth assumption says that no new substitutes for the commodity should be developed. Okay, it's explained like if some new substitutes for a commodity appear in the market, its demand generally decline. Okay, if some new substitutes for a commodity appear in the market, its demand generally decline. This is quite natural, because with the availability of new substitutes, some buyers will be attracted. Some buyers will be attracted towards new product and the demand for the older product will fall, even though price remain unchanged. Hence, the law of demand operates only when the market for a commodity is not threatened by new substitutes. Last assumption, price rise in future should not be expected. Price rise in future should not be expected. That means if the buyer of a commodity expect that its price will rise in future, they raise its demand in response to an initial price rise. Okay. For the operation of law of demand, it is necessary that there must not be any expectation of price rise in future. Because if the buyer of a commodity expect that its price will rise in future, they raise its demand in response to an initial price rise. For example, like LPG gas, if you are expecting price rises in future, so if you are expecting, they raise its demand in response to an initial price rise. And petrol is also example. Okay, so I mean to say, law of demand operates with these assumptions. Law of demand says that relationship between price and quantity demanded. This is the inverse relationship. But law of demand operates when we consider these assumptions, like income level should remain constant, taste of the buyer should not change, prices of other goods should remain constant, no new substitutes for the commodity should be developed, and last one assumption is price rise in future should not be expected. These are the 5 assumptions, and law of demand operates with these assumptions. Okay, you should follow these assumptions. Now I am going to explain demand schedule and demand curve. So question is, what is demand schedule and demand curve, and why we are studying this concept? Give these assumptions, the law of demand is explained in terms of demand schedule and demand curve. Okay, give these assumptions, the law of demand is explained in terms of demand schedule and demand curve. Demand schedule, okay, I will tell you step by step. So first of all, I want to tell you what is demand schedule. After that, demand curve. So what is demand schedule? Demand schedule explains the concept of law of demand. Okay, important point. Demand schedule explain the concept of law of demand. Law of demand is relationship between change in quantity demanded and change in price, and these concept shows with the help of demand schedule. So what is demand schedule? Demand schedule is a table that shows the quantity demanded of a goods or service at different price level. Okay, demand schedule is a table or a chart which shows the relationship between price and demand of a commodity or service per unit of time. I mean to say, if we list different quantities of a commodity demanded at different prices in the form of row and column, the resulting format is a demand schedule. I am repeating, if we list the different quantities of a commodity demanded at different prices in the form of row and column. Demand schedule, row and column. So, in the form of row and column, the resulting format is a demand schedule. I mean to say, it is a series of quantities which consumers would like to buy per unit of time at different prices. In other words, demand schedule establishes a functional relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. Law of demand have taken two type of variable. First is price and second is demand. So, price is independent variable because price is independent and demand is dependent variable. And demand schedule establishes a functional relationship between independent variable price and dependent variable demand. Okay, next point. Demand schedule may be of following two types. Two types of demand schedule. First is individual demand schedule and second one is market demand schedule. Individual demand schedule and market demand schedule. So, in next slide, we will explain individual demand schedule. Okay, individual demand schedule. So, it is very necessary to know because what is the difference between individual demand schedule and market demand schedule? Demand schedule explains the concept of law of demand and it is two types, individual demand schedule and market demand schedule. Individual demand schedule expresses different quantities of a commodity that an individual consumer can agree to buy at different prices. Okay? Individual demand schedule expresses different quantities of a commodity that an individual consumer can agree to buy at its different prices. It can be made clear with the help of an imaginary demand schedule. You can see a table which shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded, and it is a imaginary demand schedule. So, demand schedule in table shows 5 alternative prices and the corresponding quantities like a number of banana, demand per day. Each price has a unique quantity demanded associated with it. As price per banana decreases, daily demand for banana increases in accordance with the law of demand. So next is market demand schedule. Market demand schedule expresses different quantities of a commodity that can be sold in a market. Okay, that can be sold in a market at its different prices. A market demand schedule is an aggregate of individual demand schedule of all the individual consumers of a commodity in a market. You can see in this table. I mean to say, market demand schedule, you can see Mr. X purchasing power. When price decreases, what will be the change in the purchasing power of Mr. X, Mr. Y and Mr. Z? And a market demand schedule is an aggregate of Mr. X, Mr. Y and Mr. Z. Aggregate of individual demand schedule of all the individual consumers of a commodity in a market. Okay, I have told you what is the difference between individual demand schedule and market demand schedule. So next point, which I will cover in next slide, demand curve. Demand curve. It is very easy to explain. The graphical representation of demand schedule is demand curve. Okay. The graphical representation of demand schedule is demand curve. And demand curve may be of following two types, because demand schedule is two types. Demand schedule is of two types. And the graphical representation of demand schedule is demand curve. So demand curve may be of following two types. First one is individual demand curve and second one is market demand curve. Individual demand curve, like a individual demand curve shows an individual consumer increases the quantity of his consumption on a fall in price and decreases it on an increases in price, thus representing the law of demand with inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price of the commodity, which I am showing with the help of this graph, because graphical representation of demand schedule is demand curve. So next one is market demand curve. Market demand curve is the graphical presentation of a market schedule that shows how all the consumers of a given market are willing to buy the different quantities of a commodity at different prices. Okay, both the concept can be explained with the following imaginary schedule and imaginary curve. Law of demand schedule and demand curve explain the concept of demand schedule and demand curve. Demand schedule is in the form of row and column, and demand curve is graphical representation of demand schedule. Okay, so in next slide I want to explain exceptions to the law of demand. Exceptions to the law of, according to law of demand, more of a commodity will be demanded at lower prices than at higher prices, other things being equal. Now the question arises whether demand curve can slope upward and when the law of demand does not hold goods. Well, the answer to this question is that the law of demand is valid in most of the cases. In most of the cases, this is because of marginal buyers. These buyers start consuming a good if the price falls and stop consumption when its price rises. Such buyers act as though they are sitting on the margin or boundary. I mean to say margin, I mean to say boundary. However, there are certain cases where this law does not hold good. Exceptions to the law of demand occur because of intramarginal buyer. Because of intramarginal buyers. These buyers don't start or stop consumption with a change in price but merely increase or decrease their consumption. The following are the important exceptions to the law of demand. Okay, so now we will study first exception case is Giffen paradox. Giffen paradox is a first exception case of law of demand. Okay, we will study what is the concept of Giffen paradox. Most important criticism of the law of demand is Giffen paradox. Giffen was the greatest statistician of Britain during 19th century. Giffen was surprised to find out that as the price of bread increased, the British worker purchased more bread and not less of it. But this was something against the law of demand. Why did this happen? The reason given for this is that when the price of bread went up, it caused such a large decline in the purchasing power of poor people that they were forced to cut down the consumption of meat and other more expensive foods, since bread, even when its price was higher than before, was still the cheapest food article. People consumed more of it and not less when its price went up. Such goods which exhibit direct price demand relationship are called Giffen goods. Generally, those goods which are considered inferior by the consumers and which occupy a substantial place in consumers' budget are called Giffen goods. Example of such goods are coarse grain like bajra, low quality of rice and wheat, etc. Sir Robert Giffen claimed that law of demand. Sir Robert Giffen claimed that law of demand does not apply on inferior goods. Demand of inferior goods increases on an increase in their price and decreases on a fall in their price. So this is the first exception case where the law of demand does not operate. Second exception case is conspicuous necessities. First case is Giffen paradox and second case is conspicuous necessities. So that's mean demand of the commodity which were necessary for life is not affected by a change in their prices. Okay. Another important uh, exception to the law of demand occurs in case of such commodities which are necessary for life, such as salt, medicines, etc. Demand of such commodities is not affected by change in their prices because the consumers can neither increase nor decrease the consumption of such commodities. For example, if salt is 10 rupees per kg and the price of salt falls to 6 rupees per kg, the quantity of its consumption cannot be increased, or if the price increases to 12 rupees per kg, it cannot be decreases because demand of salt is of necessity which does not change with the change of the price of a commodity. Third exception case is commodities of prestige. Commodities of prestige. Law of demand does not apply on the commodities of prestige. Also, because such commodities are used by very rich people for whom the price does not matter. Law of demand does not apply on the commodity of prestige also because demand of such commodities increases even on an increase in their prices because such commodities are used by very rich people for whom the price of commodity does not matter. For example, the price of premium segment cars premium segment cars are continuously increasing. Still, their demand will go on increasing as they are demanded by higher income group people for whom price is not a matter of consideration as compared to the prestige associated with it. Okay. So, next exception case is a expectation of future change in price. Expectation of further change in price. Further change, future change, same aspect. Expectation of further change in price. Law of demand does not apply when prices are expected to change further because law of demand does not apply when prices are expected to change further. For example, if the price of commodity increases and there is an expectation of further increases in its price in near future, demand of such commodity will increase even at the increased price. Okay, because we are expecting, because there is an expectation of future increases in its price in near future, demand of such commodity will increase even at the increased price. Okay. So, next exception to the law of demand is ignorance of consumer. Ignorance of consumer is also a factor and we cannot ignore because, okay, come to the point, ignorance of consumer. This is also a factor that induces them to purchase more of a commodity at a higher price. Because the consumer purchase these commodities due to their high price, such as face cream, premium brand, talcum powder, other items of cosmetics, and decorative pieces. Example like decorative pieces, premium brand, talcum powder, other items, all the other items of cosmetic, face cream, because such consumers feel that high priced goods are better because of their mental setup. Because of their mental setup, they feel that high priced goods are better. Mentality. So now we will discuss last exception case of law of demand is emergencies. Law of demand does not apply in case of emergencies such as war, curfew, earthquake, etc. For example, in emergencies, the prices of almost all the commodities increases, but still their demand increases. Okay? In the case of emergencies, the prices of almost all the commodities increases, but still their demand increases. Okay? So thus there are certain exceptions to the law of demand, but it does not mean that it is baseless. The fact is that this law is universally applicable. Okay? Law is universally applicable. It is clear that there are certain exceptions to the law of demand, but it does not mean that it is baseless or not applicable. Almost all the situations of exceptions are not the normal situation of economic world. Normal situation of economic world. Okay? So there are certain exceptions cases to the law of demand. Law of demand, relationship between change in price and change in quantity demanded, but this operates with these assumptions. Some assumptions I have told you, 5 assumptions of law of demand, and exceptions to the law of demand is another topic we have discussed, and now I have covered all the topics which is related to law of demand. Okay, thank you.